Welcome to episode 168 of the Half Point Per Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Riggs, joined as always by my co-host, Dalton Willie. Little night pod, Dalton, little 8:45 Central Time. Don't say we don't try, folks.
It's bedtime for some of us. So I'm out here doing my very best to be ready for this podcast. Some of us over here have to watch that silly NBA.
Thunder, best team in the world. Best team in the world. Oh man, what a night for the Thunder. What a night to talk about some lessons that we learned from the 2024 fantasy football season, Dalton. That's what we're going to jump right into here. A little bit of an abbreviated pod probably tonight, but we'll get a lot done in a short amount of time. I have faith in us. And if we do have any time at the end, maybe we can give like a very abbreviated divisional round thoughts if we have time. If not, no worries there. Let's jump right into it, Dalton. I mean, we didn't really talk about this. For all I know, you could have brought 2 lessons, 10 lessons, 15 lessons. I think I have 5 or 6. I don't know how I landed on that. It's just kind of where the list stopped for me. But how many do you have?
I'm a student of the game, so I have 132. But like we can move them around and talk about what lessons I think are important. Like we can get a couple of short ones out of the way.
Okay.
My biggest lesson learned, and I think this one is incredibly important, but give up on Deontay Johnson. Just do it. Just stop doing this to yourself every season.
It's funny that he's now back with the Ravens, and the talk is kind of, well, it really is true that they did think blocking wise he'd be a great fit. It's like, man, he got cut basically. I mean, traded, but it was as close to a cut in a trade as you could possibly get. He basically got given up for free by 3 different teams this year.
He has more teams than catches in the last 10 weeks.
Oh my God. Well, he has more teams than touchdowns in that one season where he had like 1 million targets and 0 touchdowns.
Yeah, it's hard to do. Jumping into the second lesson, Jeff Janis, 2025 resurgence.
I don't know if obviously that was pre-podcast. I don't know if that was close enough to the podcast that anybody is really aware. I do think at one point we may have mentioned Paul Perkins versus Jeff Janis, but is that even his name? Is that what was that his name? Paul Perkins?
Was it Paul Perkins? Not Kendrick.
I don't know, but the fantasy footballers had a joke back then with I think Paul Perkins. God, I don't know. Random Giants running back. That's like, if his name was Smash Jackson, how much better of a player would he be?
It was Paul Perkins, just so we're aware. Paul Carey Perkins II.
The second. I mean, God. Yeah, our bet was fantasy points between Jeff Janis and Paul Perkins, and I think that final tally was something like 18-10.
What's insane is how short some running backs' shelf lives are because he is 30 years old.
Oh
in fact,
God.
Evan,
he's our age.
He's younger. His birthday's in November.
Oh my God.
Get into podcasting, folks. Don't send your kids to the NFL. It's more long-term career.
Well, especially running back. I mean, you said it, but I was looking back for one of my lessons at some ADPs from previous years. I only had gotten back like 3 years at running back. I'm like, man, not that it was a bunch of guys who were out of the league, but I was like, man, this looks a lot different now than it does now. So just something to keep in mind for all the dynasty players out there, I guess, as far as the running back landscape goes. So how many do you have that you're actually going to talk about?
I have 5. I have 5 real ones.
Okay. Because I think I have 5 or 6. I have a couple of, I guess you could probably say, lessons within the lesson. But I'll let you go first with your first big one, if you'd like.
Yeah, I'll start off with what I think is my most important one, but it's rookie wide receivers are still incredibly valuable. It's been a trend over the last couple of years where taking rookie wide receivers has been incredibly valuable to your portfolio because, one, there are a lot of unknowns with them, and so when you hit really well. Obviously, this year there were a couple. There was Malik Neighbors, there was Ladd McConkey, there was Brian Thomas Jr. At some points of the season, it was even Roma Dunze, and even Xavier Worthy finished 8 spots ahead of his ADP.
Yeah.
So there were a bunch of wins. Like the sub point to all of this is that let's not get wild with it. Let's not get a little crazy here. Thinking of, I went back and looked 2 years ago. JSN was a 4th round pick, and
Yeah.
then he was a 6th round pick, and he became valuable. But there are going to be duds in it. I think round 5, 6, and later is really where you need to start doing it with your rookie wide receivers and getting them. But they're still valuable. This class will be a great test of that metal with some of the players.
Yeah, because this class is, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later. This class, the running back position is going to look a lot like the receiver position, I think, did this year for this upcoming class. I was actually listening to somebody make this exact point today on a podcast, and they were just talking about rookie running backs, and Devin Neal got name dropped as a guy to grab late in drafts, and my shed a little tear when that happened. But yeah, and
in our draft.
yes, definitely in our dynasty draft, you will go earlier. Yeah, the only thing with rookie receivers, you said let's not get crazy, and you mentioned JSN, I think 4th round pick. You said I think Jamar Chase was a very similar value, around 4th round pick. Who can forget old Laskate with the football back in the day with with Jamar Chase? And then all of a sudden this year we get Marvin Harrison Jr. I looked; he was the wide receiver 9 this year, and I think I've got to think that is the highest ADP that a rookie receiver has ever had. We've had running backs who have pushed up that high before as rookies. Some have hit, some have not. I think it is a better bet at running back than receiver to make that bet. And that does kind of go into one of my points here, which is some of the more common bust scenarios every year, it seems like, are guys that get hyped up to either an elite tier or a very good tier in fantasy drafts, but they haven't proven it in the NFL yet. Now, there are hits from those guys, of course. Like, I would say Drake London is a guy who we all knew he was good, but he hadn't really proven it yet. Not by his own fault, but just because of the situation he hadn't proven it yet. And he worked out in a big way this year. And there are definitely other guys, I'm sure, if you look closer. But like this year, Marvin Harrison Jr., Anthony Richardson is another one this year who did not work out, who's kind of along those same lines. Looking back at the last couple of years, I mean, can you believe Dameon Pierce was the running back 15 in 2023 in ADP? Like, that just feels like 20 years ago, but that was somehow, 15 months ago. Alexander Madison, running back 17 last year. We were all so sure that he was going to take a bigger role, even though he hadn't really proven much beyond a couple of nice fill-in weeks with mega volume. Who can forget all the Kyle Pitts years? Tight end 3 in 2022 was kind of the high point when I went back and looked. And then even just like you're talking about rookie receivers, and I think kind of the point with Marvin Harrison Jr. to take forward is just be cautious with the top guys. The whole value with rookies is, like you said, it's the unknown. You can get those guys 5th, 6th, 7th, 10th, 11th round. And if they bust, it's okay. But if they hit and they're really good, it's amazing. And like, that's where a Dalton Kincaid versus Sam Laporta last year kind of comes into play into the same conversation. We just picked the wrong guy to elevate into starting tight end status in that instance. And then you think obviously back to like Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the example at running back of elevating a guy. Yeah, elevating a guy who had not done it. And we are going to see another case of that this year in Ashton Jeanty. Now, does everybody like him much better as a prospect than CEH? Yes, absolutely. Have guys like Ezekiel Elliott and Saquon Barkley and even Bijan to I would say a slightly lesser extent. Bijan was not a bust. He did not quite live up to his price, but he was still an RB1, so it did not really hurt you too badly if you took him. So rookie receivers, or rookie running backs, are the one position that's a little bit different. But man, for the most part, you just have to know you're taking a really risky pick if you're elevating a guy who has not yet done it in the NFL.
Well, and that's where the value comes with waiting on some of these guys, because if you took Marvin Harrison Jr., you really did need him to produce every week.
Yeah.
Granted, the landmine that was the second round for wide receiver this year, a lot of your league mates were probably in a similar boat. That's not going to happen every year. But if you take Brian Thomas Jr., Lad McConkey, I mean, you can sit there and wait, and it's pretty well documented at this point. There is a bye week improvement among these players. It happened with all of the rookies we saw. Lad McConkey came out and ended up as the wide receiver 11 on a points per game basis after his bye week. Brian Thomas Jr. is the wide receiver 3 on a points per game basis after his bye week. And when you're able to sit on those guys and wait a little longer and not have to be overly like zealous about that, you really have a way safer roster construction. And I mean, your first point from 2024 kind of leads me into my second one here, but it's by talent dips. So this year,
so my second one is take advantage of uncertainty and slow reaction, and I think we're going to talk about the exact same thing here.
We probably are. This year was like a really indicative year where a lot of good players took dips for indistinguishable situations. Josh Jacobs was a 4th round value, which doesn't make a lot of sense when the year before on a worse team, he was a 3rd round value. He went into a better offense. Terry McLaurin was in an incredibly uncertain environment, but we have known year over year he's been an incredibly productive player, and he finally hit on that. Derrick Henry, despite being every fantasy football player's dream scenario, was a 3rd round pick in fantasy drafts. Saquon Barkley, one of the most premier and elite running backs of the NFL, went to a better team and couldn't get elevated to a 1st round status in drafts. There was a lot of talent in the NFL that people let drop off. Mark Andrews, who turned the season around, was the tight end 6, ended up producing as the tight end 2. Like, we were over-indexing on a lot of these one-season wonders. And it's not to say these players are bad, but we were going very high on Jalen Waddle, who really is a one-season wonder at this point in his career.
Well, I mean, he had the rookie year, and then he's been pretty good. Like, I don't know if I'd say he's a one-season wonder.
I'll say he's not been a valuable 2nd round pick on a consistent basis. Yeah. I'll say that.
That's fair.
And we indexed highly on those players. And then a lot of the talented players, another one of these is Jackson Smith-Njigba, who was the best wide receiver in his draft class, who got an upgrade at offensive coordinator and went drastically lower in drafts than he should have been. And even like this one, it's a little different. But man, Adam Thielen was undrafted.
Yeah.
And he ended up producing as a top 36 wide receiver, missing 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So sometimes just take the safe bet. Like if you were taking Jalen Polk at the end of your drafts, I get it. I understand you're taking a little moonshot there. But sometimes you can mix those guys in with some of the proven players in the NFL and just buy that talent when it's no one else is wanting to.
Yeah, by the talent and by the age. I think sometimes Dynasty Brain seeps over in the redraft a little bit. And if I can redraft outside of just the concerns of age drop-off from season to season, other than that, it's like, what do I care that Adam Thielen's 35 or however old he is, 34 in redraft? Like, the guy, he is still good. I mean, I don't want to say he showed no signs of slowing down, but he still looks like a legitimate wide receiver 2 in the NFL. And another guy like DeAndre Hopkins, depending on where he is next year, is kind of a guy in that similar boat. So you actually went a little bit of a different direction than I thought you were going to, just with the examples. But my second one I'll give here is, like I said, take advantage of uncertainty and slow reactions by the market. And kind of the main one is Rashee Rice. Like, this is definitely a Rashee Rice point. He had the suspension looming. They had multiple receivers, obviously, they brought in Xavier Worthy from the draft, Hollywood Brown in free agency. I think it was probably mostly the suspension, but also I do think those other receivers were weighing him down on draft boards, maybe just a little bit, because I feel like I remember early reports out of training camp where it was like, oh, Rashee Rice is getting like all the targets, and people were like, oh, that's interesting. And I just think we were a little bit slow, myself included, especially, to just say, you know what? Screw the suspension. let's take him at wide receiver 20 and let's just see. Because if you would have done a redraft after 2 or 3 weeks, he's probably a top 15 overall pick. And obviously he got hurt, so that didn't work out like you hoped if you did take that chance on him in your draft. But just guys like that, that have uncertainty. You mentioned a couple of these guys, but like Saquon Barkley, like you said, new team, new situation. Derrick Henry, new team, new situation. Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, Aaron Jones, all of those guys, older running backs, high carries, and most of the doubts were based on history. They weren't based on those guys. It was based on history. As it turns out, those guys are all still quite good. And those are the types of picks, whether it's a Rashee Rice, a suspension looming or whatever. Just, I don't know. It's hard to give too many more specific examples, but every year I feel like we have guys in drafts where there's a cloud hanging over them for one reason or another. And I'm not saying fill your team with those guys, but those are league winning gambles that if they hit, you're very happy in championship weekend.
I mean, a good example, and it didn't turn out the way it should have because he got injured. But Chris Godwin was the wide receiver 34 under players like Raheem Mostert, Zamir Weiss, Najee Harris, Christian Kirk, and Keenan Allen. And had he not been injured, I think Chris Godwin was a top 5 wide receiver on the season. And the talent's always been there. And there was no reason for him to be going that low other than there was issues with whether or not Baker could repeat his performance. And offensive coordinator.
And that's a great point and a great way to think about it too, because obviously the year before, both Bucs guys were huge values for that exact reason. The Seahawks guys were huge values because there was the Geno Smith uncertainty. Now, can that bite you in the butt sometimes and situations are actually as bad as we're afraid of? Sure, it can from time to time. However, you met like a guy like Adam Thielen, part of it was probably age, and part of it was probably, oh, I know the Panthers are terrible. For a while, they were. Turns out, down the stretch, they were not so terrible. And all of a sudden, Adam Thielen, very useful for fantasy football.
Yeah, well, like the last example I'll throw out here was the wide receiver 27 in pre-draft was T. Higgins, which never really made sense because the season prior in 2023, he wasn't a bad player. He was an injured player. And that's always been a bugaboo of his career. But you're taking him in the 5th round of fantasy drafts. Obviously, people who took that gamble were highly rewarded when he played, and he finished the season incredibly strongly. But it's not always as hard as we make it out. Like some players that were going above T. Higgins, it's pretty easy for me to self-select these players out of the way. For instance, you have DeAndre Swift. The hard pass. You have CJ Stroud, who was the QB5.
Yeah.
You have Joe Mixon, who it turned out was a good pick, but I still think I would have rather had T. Higgins if you compare their seasons side by side. And these are like 20-round differences in draft position. So these aren't just like you reached. Another one.
20 spot differences, to be clear.
Yeah. Another player, like Rachaad White. Good player, not great player. Like sometimes you should just look and say, well, which one is the better player at the game of the NFL football? And then you can start doing a little bit of comparison about situations, but sometimes better players just outperform regardless of where they're at.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit more about T. Higgins soon, so I don't want to say too much more about that.
Well, you're up. That was my second.
Okay. I'll go with the one that was actually first on my list. And this is not a new lesson. This is just a lesson I want to reinforce. I kind of just hit on it there a little bit, but we really should not overestimate our ability to predict specific roles for players and predict how exactly things are going to shake out in offense. Like, I'm even talking borderline elite guys in fantasy football. You look at guys like Devon Achane and James Cook. Those are 2 smaller backs. People question them between the tackles, question their roles inside the 5-yard line. Turns out both those guys had a crap load of touchdowns this year and were used inside the 5. I mean, for Achane, he benefited from a Raheem Mostert being in and out of the lineup a lot, which who who could have possibly seen that coming after the year he had the previous year. And then James Cook, it was just a little bit of regression to the mean, I would say, for him. Like Jahmyr Gibbs is another where, his rookie year, we talked a lot about the touchdown issues, and really most of his touchdowns were either big plays or very intentional. Let's get this guy in and get him a touchdown or two here and there. It was mostly Montgomery time inside the 5 and 10. This year, as it turns out, those guys got entire drives to themselves, which has its pros and cons. It was a little bit deflating if a drive doesn't go anywhere with one guy and another guy it does. And it wasn't like purely one guy has a drive, one guy has another drive, but it did go like that more this year than last year. And as a result, Jahmyr Gibbs, more red zone work. So even before Montgomery got hurt, he was outperforming his preseason expectations, I think partially because of that, because he actually was not getting probably the passing game work that we wanted for a good portion of the season. Another guy who, different type of argument, Chase Brown. We had questions, I think, a little bit about the player, but our questions about the player led to us doubting what the role could be. And we did say, I think, that, if he gets better at XYZ, then, I mean, this is a very explosive player. I just don't think we and others built that into our ranks probably good enough for Chase Brown. Obviously, we didn't, based on where he finished this season. So that's another one. And then, like, other guys who we had too high of hopes for because we thought we knew what their roles were going to be, like Rachaad White. We were saying all off seasons, like, man, if there was just a guy that would take his job, like, I'm not too worried about Rachaad White. And as it turns out, Rachaad White somehow actually finished right around where he was being drafted still, even with Bucky Irving being RB12, RB13, whatever he was. But turns out there's another running back on the team now better than Rachaad White. Devin Singletary flat out loses his job. I mean, I was guilty before the season of saying, like, yeah, as a solid player, like, it's pretty ugly. You get down to running back at that point, you just take the guy because he's got the role. Turns out just because front office loves him doesn't mean he's keeping the job. And then Zamir White is kind of the poster boy for that going wrong this year. And we don't have to talk too much more about that because we have ad nauseum.
Yeah, well, like another guy was Josh Downs, who was wide receiver 68.
Yeah.
Because Will Richardson doesn't target the slot. He throws deep bombs. Turns out, I mean, it worked out from a value perspective, let alone Josh Downs had his biggest games with Anthony Richardson. And yeah, I mean, sometimes it's really hard to predict situation. And part of what we have to do all offseason is play it out the best we can in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
But especially with Rachaad White, we were pretty right on the situation.
Yeah.
We were pretty wrong on taking the bet that Bucky Irving would be the guy to usurp him.
Well, and it's funny because Bucky Irving, I mean, we follow a lot of the same draft people. I would say he was not a draft analyst favorite. Would that be fair to say? People were not big fans of Bucky Irving. When he got drafted there, it was kind of like, okay, I guess Rachaad White has this backfield for at least another year until they draft somebody better next year, hopefully.
Yeah, and I mean, he scored like one of the lowest spark scores among any running back. What's funny is going into draft season, it changed on draft day because of how far Troy Franklin fell. But Troy Franklin was the darling of the fantasy community. And Bo Nix and Bucky Irving were the ho-hums, like, these are kind of products of their systems.
Yeah.
It turns out, at least after 1 year, we were all a little off on that one as a community. And Troy Franklin might have been the bigger product of that community.
Yeah, perhaps. Okay, your next one, Dalton.
This one we don't have to spend long on, but it's already starting. So just so we know, in 2 weeks, the first best ball drops for 2025. But just don't worry about the Packers wide receiver room. Like, there's no amount of breath that you can spend on it that you're going to dissect it.
I did a second best ball draft offline after we drafted the other day. I took Jaden Reed. I was like, you know what? If I could just get one nice game from Jaden Reed this week, And then I went pretty heavy on the Chiefs in that one. Just get one nice Jaden Reed game, get me to the Chiefs. He was on his way, 50 yards, second quarter, and then he got hurt.
Yeah. Should have listened to me in the future. The Packers wide receivers between Dobbs, Dontavian Wicks, and Jaden Reed are all in the top 8 in the NFL in drop rate. If you chart fantasy points per game among all eligible pass catchers in the Green Bay Packers, you will not find an answer because it just depends is the answer. Mm-hmm. Among these, you throw in Christian Watson, who did in fact have a lowered snap rate like everybody thought he would. He also had the second most high-performing weeks of any Packers wide receiver.
I will say, so Christian Watson tore his ACL, correct?
Correct.
So if we have no Christian Watson for most of next season, let's say conservatively, he'll probably be out half the year. Do you still feel the same way?
Absolutely. I will not bother wasting my time looking into this room until they have an alpha and we can worry about who benefits from that alpha. I don't think this receiving core is going to be productive for fantasy purposes on a consistent basis until they have somebody in that room that Jordan Love can reliably look to, and then these guys can fill their roles. Because you look at where all of these players lined up on the field, and it's everywhere. And it's starting to look to me like Matt LaFleur is really trying hard to find roles for everybody and can't find them because they all do good, but not great at most of what they're being asked to do, which became endemic to the Packers season.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like, I still very much believe in Jaden Reed. However, I will have to see it on a consistent basis, kind of like I talked about last week, I think, just going through his game log. I have to see it on a consistent basis before I'm telling people to really spend big-time capital on him. He can come right over to Rashad Bateman Island and join Rashad Bateman and I on Evan's Misfit Toys, who he still believes in, land. I mean, Jaden Reed has had more success than Bateman, although Bateman kind of sneaky, like wide receiver 3 season this year. It kind of happened.
And this is not me saying Jaden Reed's a bad player.
Yeah.
Dontavian Wicks would be a great player if he could catch.
Yeah.
Just get the ball in those hands. But it is me saying that I think Jaden Reed would be a lot better if he wasn't being asked to do a lot of wide receiver 1 things on a daily basis.
Yeah, they're a team that will be interesting to see what they do in the draft. Devontae Adams has not ruled out going to a former team of his that rhymes with Schmackers. Did you see that on the Kay Adams show?
No, I thought he might go back to the Schmraiders.
I don't think so. But yeah, I also think a part of this discussion, I'll just ask you this question. I know he dealt with injuries throughout the season, but were you at all disappointed with the year from Jordan Love that we got? Because I kind of feel like I was a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to CJ Stroud where there was a bit of a sophomore slump. And I'm going to do my best not to repeat my mistakes with Trevor Lawrence here, where obviously throughout the entire season, Jordan Love was on the injury report for a ton of different injuries.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with Jordan Love is he's kind of a mid-2000s era quarterback where he throws up a lot of really difficult balls. And sometimes they look really good. But a lot of the times, and we saw this in the playoff game, they're interceptions.
Yeah.
And it makes it hard for him to be a consistent producer. And once the tape is out on players like that, the defenses normally adjust pretty well and get pretty aggressive. So going to need to see some steps forward. He'll still be in my top 12 quarterbacks because he has that explosiveness.
Well, and also you think about like Jaden Reed, his best receiver, what you're just talking about. I would say that's probably one of the few holes in Jaden Reed's game right now. So that may be part of the inconsistency and the disconnect that we're seeing between quarterback and role and player and just all those things not meshing like we think they should.
Well, and you extrapolate out, like having that many receivers with such a high drop rate is likely indicative that, yes, they might be catchable balls, but they're not easily catchable balls for a lot of these players. Now, there's an entire 2-minute video you can watch on the internet of Jontavian Wicks dropping very easy balls. So it does happen both ways. But at the end of the day, like, he is kind of he is the kind of quarterback that T. Higgins could very much be a great fit with, in the way he likes to throw those 50-50s and those tight windows.
Yeah.
Not that T should go anywhere.
Yeah, we'll see if he even makes it to real free agency.
Yeah.
Okay. This one for me, I almost want to pose it as a question because I want to see what you think. Is the RB dead zone dead? And I ask that, and I'll add this bit of context or rationale behind my thinking here. I think fantasy football drafters have finally gotten smart enough to where we're not elevating guys. Like I mentioned, Devin Singletary and Zamir White is like the one guy who's like playing his day. RB24, like get him out of here. Should not have been in there. That's an RB dead zone guy. But you look at this year, kind of in that RB2 range, and in some of these guys' cases, lower tier RB2 range. You've got Josh Jacobs. You've got Rashad White, who in a roundabout way, he worked out. It was fine. James Cook was a high-end RB2. Joe Mixon, kind of a mid RB2. Alvin Kamara was, I think, a mid to low-end RB2. Kenneth Walker was around RB20. Aaron Jones in that range. James Conner. Isaiah Pacheco was a pretty high-end RB2, low-end RB1. That one, injuries took that one out. James Conner. Ramondre Stevenson, David Montgomery, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, who we know how we feel about DeAndre Swift, but the end of the year finish always ends up being okay to where it just kind of is what it is. I think we're finally maybe reaching a tipping point. I don't know if it's because this old guard of running backs is sticking around longer than most. I don't know if it's because fantasy drafters are getting smarter and guys like Myles Gaskin are not getting elevated as frequently into this top 24 conversation, Zamir White excluded. But I'll be curious to see these next couple of years kind of how we feel about it as some of these other running backs age out and we have a new age of running backs come in.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because, like you mentioned, there's probably 6 to 7 running backs in the NFL who have starting jobs right now who historically you would not expect to still be in the NFL, especially playing at the level that they're playing at. And now we have what looks to be a 2018 draft class for the running backs again.
Yeah.
Where there is so much talent in it that they're very likely there are already players who I'm seeing under talk. Like last year, Travion Henderson would have been the RB1 in your dynasty draft. Like undoubtedly the RB1. And this year, I think he probably slots in as like 7 or 8, maybe lower. And Quinshon Judkins, another player who would have been a RB1 in your dynasty draft last year.
And Judkins was the guy, if you go back like a year, where it was like, oh yeah, like he's the no doubt can't miss prospect of this class. And then Ashton Genty emerges, and that's no longer the case.
Yeah. And I mean, you have Omarion Hampton and Caleb Iowa's running back.
Oh God, yeah, I can't remember his last name. But then you also have both the Kansas kids, Devin Neal and DJ Giddens as well.
Yeah, and the class is deeper than what we're even talking about here. So once that guard shuffles out, there's probably, and the other problem here is we as a community, especially best ball, has gotten really greedy with the wide receiver position and has really tried to squeeze all the value out of it. And that's what's pushed some of these ADPs up so high.
Yep.
And led to the deflation of some of these running backs. And as we talked about 2 pods ago, this was an all-time bad year for the wide receiver position. So it'll be interesting to see once some of the early drafting data gets in mid to late February for the 2025 season, how drafters are responding to that. Because like even a James Conner really shouldn't still be as productive as he is. And Like nothing.
But I see no reason why
No.
he shouldn't be next year. And he's probably going to be a guy who, if he only misses his 3 or 4 games, is probably going to hit on his
Yeah.
ADP next
Well,
year.
like out of the old guard still remaining, the only two I would have substantial concerns going into next year would be Aaron Jones, who I think we did see, and then Joe Mixon, who I think we're seeing some of the like creep as the season has rolled on with his injury history.
Yeah.
But outside of that, like if you're going to fade Derrick Henry, James Conner, Saquon Barkley all next season, I don't think all three of them become bottom tier running backs just out of the blue.
With that said, not necessarily these guys, but there are going to be guys we don't expect who lose their jobs because of this draft. I mean, it happens all the time when talented running back drafts come in like this. Like you think about Tyler Algier, who I think people liked, not loved, had a exciting rookie season. People were like, "Oh yeah, Tyler Algier RB2 next year, it's gonna be." And then Bijan comes, and he's not just dead, but he, as far as an every week starter, he's just dead. We're gonna have multiple situations kind of like that. I feel like.
Well, and he was a 1,000-yard rusher and one of the better missed tackle rates among running backs. Which, I'm not saying this is going to happen. Very interested in the Tampa Bay situation.
Yeah,
very interested in who they take. Not saying Bucky's dead. Definitely not. But if you just look over the long term.
I just had Captain America going through my head when he
or Tyrone Tracy, even, who I think people are very excited about next season. Like
the Dallas Cowboys. Can we please kill Rico Dowdle?
Yeah. So it's going to be a really interesting NFL draft. It's a very exciting one, especially because from what I've understood so far, it's not incredibly good across the board.
Yeah, quarterback, it's weak. I'd say receiver, it's a little down too. I don't know about tight end. And then without getting into other positions, I couldn't really tell you.
Dane Brugler wrote it in his last top 100 article. And he said, usually there's 16 to 20 players who have a true first round grade by scouts. He said it's about 12 this year. And he said a lot of teams are looking to trade back into later rounds just to amass value at player positions rather than take an early pick. So also when you hear the draft is defensive heavy, that to me is an alarm bell for this isn't a good draft because we know the NFL is an offensive league.
Yep. Okay, Dalton. Next one for you.
Passing does matter when you're drafting a quarterback.
Yep.
And there are two players I want to highlight here. Two players I very much enjoy. The first one, talked about him a lot. It's Anthony Richardson. I think he can still improve his game. I think he can get better. With that being said, he was QB6. That's a little absurd for a player who can't throw the ball when your only job is to really throw the ball.
Yeah.
And because of that, he is heralded as an amazing disappointment in this year's draft. He was a terrible pick fantasy-wise, not beholden to just the benchings, but even as like a startable player, you more than likely were burned weeks in and week out. Yeah. Secondly, Kyler Murray, we're getting to there needs to be a conversation because since his first year with Cliff Kingsbury, who seems to do something with quarterbacks, he has not been very good, nor has he been very consistent. And he had multiple games under 200 yards passing this season, and they directly impacted his fantasy volume. Meanwhile, productive passers who a lot of people ho-hummed about, Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, went out and produced top 6 seasons in fantasy points. And that
even like a guy like Joe Burrow, who I think was going QB7, like not like disrespectfully low, but the thing with Burrow is like, he doesn't have that elite upside because he doesn't run. And turns out you can still have an insane passing season and be right up there with the guys who run.
Yeah. Well, and then and it's an anomalous season. I get that. A lot happens. But Sam Darnold was the QB 31. and we knew Sam Darnold was starting, which going below guys like Deshaun Watson and everything else makes sense with the history coming into the season Sam Darnold has. But really, sometimes it's okay just to take some of these pocket passers late. And we maybe need to index less on quarterbacks that just run really well, because it's gotten to the point where you're betting on a passer making the same leap that Josh Allen did. And we have not seen that from any NFL passer except for Josh Allen.
Did you watch the video I sent you about Josh Allen? It's on the app that might be banned by Sunday. But it was a Josh Allen video and an NFL put out where they're talking to him, I guess talking to a trainer he's worked with, where for him to fix his throwing, it was like basically his shoulder was doing like all the work, and with the way his hips were torquing, like it was messing up his shoulder, and it was why he was so inaccurate, and he had to do a lot of aligning of the body to make it work out. And I just had to say that it was not a simple process for Josh Allen to turn from what he was to what he is now.
Yeah. And I think this conversation is going to get a little tedious going into this season because, and it depends on what happens on Sunday. Jaden Daniels' passing is not great. He's good. He's above average or average. His running has really, really helped his game. Mm-hmm. And I just want to see, there's been some QB1 talk for Jaden Daniels, the 2025 big board. And this is one of those situations where Jaden Daniels should be a top 12 quarterback. Jaden Daniels probably shouldn't go over anybody who is elite, except for maybe Mahomes at this point.
Yeah. Won't push back too much there. Real quick, I'll skip my sixth one, go straight to number 5 here and close this out because I know you have a hard out here in just a moment. This one is hard. This one feels maybe a little counterintuitive to a lot of what we've said, but I think it'll make sense when you hear it. Make sure you aren't drafting last year's winning team this year. And I know, like, we all look back at the previous season, and you know, I'm guilty. You're like, it's really easy. Like, I'm not even saying that these are the issues, but you look Saquon Barkley, RB1, Jamar Chase, wide receiver 1, and it's like, it's really hard to repeat at those positions. And I'm more concerned about Saquon, and I just feel uneasy. I have him as my number 1 overall player, but I'm just a little nervous about that. I mean, you look back at the top 5 in ADP this season, I think this was a little bit of an anomaly, but Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, only Bijan worked out of that top 5 to be close to what you needed. There's not really any overarching lessons with those guys. With CMC, it's probably like, hey, pay a little closer attention to the injury stuff. But even then, they weren't telling us anything until after we drafted. So thanks, Kyle Shanahan, for that. I mean, this is really probably mostly a Saquon Barkley point. Like, this was the year to draft Saquon Barkley. Next year, I'm not saying don't take him at 1 overall, but what I am saying is even if he was going 4 overall, there is very little chance he's going to be like a great value next year. And then I also kind of want to steer this to guys like a T. Higgins you mentioned earlier, like guys who had disappointing years the year before for whatever it may be, outside of they're just a bad player. Look at the mitigating factors. Like T. Higgins goes from wide receiver 12 and 13 ADP back-to-back years to wide receiver 27. And it was mostly, like you said, it was injuries to him, injuries to Joe Burrow. And just think about some other guys from this year who might fall into that category of they had a bad year for one reason or another. Maybe part of it was their own personal struggles, but they're going to be too undervalued going into next year because people are drafting the guys who proved themselves this year, like Patrick Mahomes, QB 11. We've talked about that a little bit. Anthony Richardson, he finished QB 25. He shouldn't be like top 8, maybe not top 10, but I could see him if he's like QB 18 next year. It's like, yeah, that's like my favorite QB 2 in the league to have. Trevor Lawrence feels like he could be a forgotten man. Travis Etienne, if he's going anywhere around his finish this year, which was 36, he's a guy I'm interested in. I mean, AJ Brown, maybe he's too good to fall into that category. Maybe he'll get boosted up anyway. Jalen Waddle might be the biggest example from this category.
Well, Sam
Laporta, exactly.
A ton of people.
I mean, Roma Dunze, like think about Jamison Williams, think about Quentin Johnston, like young guys who just didn't live up to the hype in year one. JSN, like Roma Dunze is going to be a guy that I think is going to be undervalued next year. Marvin Harrison Jr. is probably going to be a value next year.
Well, I think it goes the other way too. And I'm not disparaging him, but like Chase Brown is a player round 2 value, and a lot of the mocks I've already seen.
Yeah.
Played 98% of the running back snaps when Zach Moss went down.
Bengals are drafting a running back.
Yes. And just be careful. And there are going to be players who I feel the opposite about this, like Mike Evans. I already see the narrative where it's like they just wanted to get him to 1,000 yards. It's not really the case, but do your thing. Tyreek Hill, we'll see, but definitely going to be undervalued. Devontae Adams has like the stink of the Jets on him, but quietly was super productive still.
Yep, and that's like exactly the Saquon thing that happened. He had the stink of the Giants, and I think that was a big part of him not being elevated to where he should have been.
Or even like probably going to be a major player that you and I talk about all offseason because we both really love him. But like there's going to be a lot of Chris Olave slander on the timeline.
Yep.
And another player where a lot of it's not as fun.
Guys, his quarterback tried to get him killed.
And just waiting on, I mean, it's very similar to Terry.
I could throw better passes than the hospital balls he was getting from Derek Carr.
And then in the meantime, there are players who I think we're going to get a little crazy on who had really good finishes that people are going to over-index on. And just, I think it's a really good point is don't draft this year's winning team next year because it's not going to be the same.
Never is.
Rashee Rice, Chris Godwin, screaming values.
They may be, especially. I mean, Rashee Rice is going to be facing a suspension next year. Jordan Addison, another guy who will be facing a suspension next year. That is going to do it. Allegedly. I'll let you get out of here on that, Dalton. That is going to do it for episode 168 of the Half Point per podcast. Give us a follow, Twitter, Instagram, and if it is still there after Sunday, TikTok at Half Point per pod. Subscribe to the YouTube. The link to all of these things will be in the show notes as always. Our show is available anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, etc. Leave us a 5-star review. Thank you all so much again for listening today, and we'll talk to you again next week. Go Chiefs.
God, I hate Kevin.